you may be in. But welcome. I'm John Dotson, the Deputy Director of the Global Taiwan Institute. We are a 501c3 think tank located in Washington, D.C., focused on contemporary Taiwan issues and the U.S.-Taiwan relations. And we pursue this mission through a range of programs that includes our important nightly publication, the Global Taiwan Brief, which is available on our website, containing analytical articles on Taiwan politics, defense issues, economics and trade, and social issues. We also do it through our podcast series, in Taiwan Salon and Taiwan Insights, as well as through periodic public policy discussion seminars, such as the one we're having today. Thank you very much for joining us. I think this is a very important topic. Today we're looking at the defense policy changes in the Indo-Pacific region in response to rising tensions over Taiwan. That's certainly, the rising tensions over Taiwan is certainly something that's gotten a great deal of attention, increased attention over the course of the past year, most prominently in the large scale and very provocative military exercises that were conducted by military forces of the People's Republic of China in the immediate wake of a visit to Taiwan by then U.S. Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi, again, most provocatively with the missile launches that were fired around and in some instances over Taiwan itself, including some that landed in Japan's exclusion zone. And this increased PRC military activity has prompted defense policy changes in a number of ways. It has done so certainly in Taiwan itself, which over the past year or a couple of years has seen some very prominent policy changes that have taken place. One of those being significantly increased defense spending. I believe for this past year, the defense budget that Taiwan's government passed was, I believe, about a 14% increase from the year before. Also, in late 2021, there was a very outside of the regular budget, there was a very large supplemental that was passed to fund the increased production of domestic anti-ship missiles and anti-aircraft missiles. So Taiwan has certainly ramped up its own defense spending. And then, perhaps most prominently and most politically costly, if that's the right way to put it, at least one that involved greatest expenditure of political capital, Taiwan's government took the dramatic step at the end of this past year of announcing the increase of conscripted service time, which had been shortened to 4 months for young men. They announced a new plan where that was going to be expanded out to a year of required training for young men in Taiwan, along with a broad framework plan as to how those increased numbers of conscripted service soldiers would be used. So within Taiwan itself, there's certainly been some fairly dramatic steps taken. But I think perhaps at least in the United States anyway, less attention has been paid to some of the ways in which the more provocative, aggressive military behavior by the PRC has also been impacting other countries in the region and producing changes in those countries. Most prominently, say in Japan and the Philippines, a couple of countries that we're going to take a look at today in terms of late this past year with the Japanese government itself announcing or laying out a new national security strategy and plans for significantly increased defense spending, as well as developments in the Philippines, which has recently made a new agreement with the United States for the use of military bases in the Philippines, and with some, I would say anyway, surprisingly frank comments by the new president of the Philippines, Ferdinand Marcos, expressing his concerns over potential conflict over Taiwan and what it might mean for the Philippines. So we're going to try to delve into some of those issues a little bit more today. And we're very fortunate to be joined by three very distinguished speakers who are going to help us delve into that. First, on my immediate left, I have Lieutenant General Wallace Chip Gregson, United States Marine Corps retired. General Gregson served in a number of prominent national security positions throughout the course of his career. I hope I get all these right. From 1990 to 2000, he was Director of Asia-Pacific Policy in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. From 2001 to 2003, he served as Commanding General of the 3rd Marine Expeditionary Force in Japan. From 2003 to 2005, he was Commanding General of Marine Corps Forces Pacific and Marine Corps Forces Central Command, in which he exercised command over 70,000 U.S. Marine Corps and U.S. Navy personnel in those two theaters. And following retirement from 2009 to 2011, he also served as the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Asian and Pacific Security Affairs. And General Gregson is a graduate of the United States Naval Academy and also holds master's degrees from the Naval War College and Sullivan Virginia College. Thank you for joining us today, gentlemen. Then, at the end of the table, we're also very fortunate to have with us today Dr. Naoko Aoki, who is an associate political scientist at the RAND Corporation. Her previous academic work has focused on East Asian security issues, including very good work on nuclear policy, nuclear security policy in Asia and the North Korean nuclear program. She has also served in previous positions as a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and in a nuclear security fellowship with the House of Representatives. And prior to her academic career, she was also a journalist for a number of years with Japan's Kyodo News. She holds an MA in International Relations from Johns Hopkins SAIS and a PhD from the University of Maryland. Dr. Naoki, thank you, ma'am, for joining us today. And also, a special note of thanks, I think, is due to Dr. Renato Cruz de Castro, who has very kindly offered to join us and to share his expertise with us at a very uncivilized hour in the Philippines. He's joining us from Manila, where it's now after 10:30 p.m. So we have really abused his generosity in asking him to join us today. We're very fortunate that he has done so. Dr. De Castro is a distinguished professor in the International Studies Department of De La Salle University in Manila, and also where he holds the Dr. Aurelio Calderon Chair in Philippine-American Relations. He has taught courses in a number of Filipino government institutions for years, to include the National Defense College, the General Staff College of the Philippines Armed Forces, and the Foreign Service Institute. He has also previously served as a consultant to the National Security Advisor of the National Security Council during the Aquino administration, 2010 to 2016. He has published widely in academic journals on international relations and international security issues. And he holds 2 master's degrees from the University of the Philippines, a PhD from the University of Taiwan. So once again, a special note of thanks to Dr. Castro for joining us today. As we get ready to go into our conversation, I'm going to ask each of the panels to speak for a few minutes. I think I will extend or present the floor first to Dr. De Castro, again, in light of the late hour there. Before our speakers begin, I would like to remind our audience, both those who have joined us here in person today, as well as those joining us online, that YouTube are part of this conversation. And after the presentations by our speakers, we're going to allow time for Q&A. So we welcome your questions. If you are here live with us today, when that time comes, if you'd like to ask a question, just please raise your hand. We'll bring a microphone to you. Please identify yourself and ask your question. If you are one of those joining us online, you can submit questions to us 2 ways. One is through the chat window on the YouTube, if you are watching it there. You can also email questions to contact@globaltaiwan.org. And that's contact@globaltaiwan.org. So we welcome your questions when the time comes for Q&A. I think with that said, without further ado, I will turn the floor to our speakers. And Dr. De Castro, can you hear me, sir? Are you ready to begin?
Yeah, I'm ready to begin.
Okay, I will turn the virtual floor over to you, sir.
Good morning there in Washington, D.C. It's looking forward probably joining you by the early summer when I will have my fellowship in the East-West Center. So I'll start my presentation with an anecdote regarding a webinar that happened about a year ago. It was organized by a Japanese think tank. And during the webinar, we were talking about Taiwan. And during the webinar, an Australian academic raised the issue. Isn't there any U.S. ally near Taiwan? Because all the U.S. bases are, of course, located in Okinawa and in Guam. Then I reacted, yeah, you have the nearest treaty ally there that happened to be the Philippines. Everyone seems surprised that the Philippines is a treaty ally of the United States. Of course, this was understandable because it was during the period of Duterte. So let me start my presentation. First slide, please. First slide. Can you move the slide? Or do I do the movement?
We can see it on our end.
Okay, first slide, can you move it? Okay, of course, obviously the Philippines is the closest country to Taiwan. It's very, the Philippines is in a way the border between Southeast Asia and Northeast Asia. Next slide, please. So both countries are located at the either side of the Luzon Strait, which is, of course, a very important choke point. It is a choke point for, of course, where you can move from the northern part of the South China Sea into the Western Pacific. It was a very important area of operation during the Second World War, where, of course, you have U.S. Navy subs intercepting Japanese convoys that were, of course, taking supplies from Southeast Asia going to Japan. Next slide, please. Of course, the two countries are so close. When I deliver a talk in the Armed Forces of the Philippines and I emphasize the importance of Taiwan, at the onset of the Second World War in the Pacific, just a few hours after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, you have, of course, the bombers from the Japanese Imperial Army attacking MacArthur's bombers, B-17 at Clark Air Base, and practically destroying 50% of them, rendering, of course, American air power significantly, of course, destroyed just a few hours after Pearl Harbor. That's how close we are with, of course, Taiwan and vice versa. Next slide, please. So the first crisis, of course, happened, for the Philippines. This was the first time that we really became aware of the fact that we're close to Taiwan. And I could still remember the USS Kitty Hawk was docked in Manila Bay 2 weeks before the actual crisis. So this was a time that the Philippines was also shocked by the presence of Chinese forces that occupied Mischief Reef just in February of 1996. So during this time, the Philippines was, asking Washington, why did this happen? Then a month later, of course, you have a greater crisis that happened. And this was a time that the United States government, through the back doors, asked the Ramos administration if it could use some of the facilities that were, of course, evacuated by the U.S. Air Force, 13th Air Force, after the withdrawal of American forces from Clark and Subic Naval Base in 1992. Next slide, please. So at the time, of course, it's the United States, the Clinton administration deployed 2 carrier battle groups. One of them came from Manila Bay. Next slide, please. So after the incident, of course, both sides decided to revitalize the alliance that was, of course, severely undermined by the withdrawal of American forces after, of course, the Philippine Senate did not concur to the Philippine-American Cooperation Treaty of 1991. So this was one of the important motivations behind the decision to negotiate for a visiting forces agreement. So the possibility that U.S. forces could have access to northern Luzon just in case you have a repeat of what happened in March 1996. Next slide, please. So eventually, the Taiwan Strait crisis was forgotten as one of the important rationales behind the negotiation and eventual signing of the Visiting Forces Agreement, as of course the two allies started to focus first on the war of terror in the aftermath of 9/11, then of course the shift of Philippine attention away from internal security to the South China Sea dispute in around 2011. Next slide, please. So the impact of the Ukraine-Russia war. Next slide, please. So you have, of course, the war happened. Initially, the Philippines, President Duterte tried to maintain what I called a critical neutrality. But eventually, after some briefing from the Philippine military, President Duterte got convinced that there was a possibility that China might repeat what Russia did with Ukraine. So this basically was the reason why suddenly, despite his, initially he was so anti-American, he instructed the Philippine ambassador to Washington, D.C., who is still currently our ambassador in Washington, D.C., Ambassador Babes Romualdez, to offer the possible use of, American facilities, especially Clark Air Base, just in case. Now he said, just in case the war spreads into the Indo-Pacific region. I think he was really referring to the fact that China might take a page from Russia's handbook regarding, of course, the invading a country that China and Russia would claim as their part, formerly the part of China, which is of course Taiwan. Next slide, please. So the proposal, of course, also seen as an attempt to recalibrate the alliance after, of course, you have the alliance being in one way or the other diminished during the early part of the Duterte administration. Next slide, please. So the underlying reason, of course, is the fact that, like other Southeast Asian countries, President Duterte, despite his anti-American sentiment, saw the possibility that, of course, China might follow suit in the South China Sea, and more significantly in the Taiwan Straits, or of course in Taiwan. And of course, again, this is a recognition on his part that, despite his effort to appease China, China has still continued its aggressive and coercive action against the Philippines, especially in the South China Sea, and probably, of course, in Taiwan. Next slide, please. So, Don, this is, of course, what I mentioned earlier. So even President Duterte, in the latter part of his term, basically took into account that China indeed has an expansionist goal, not only in the South China Sea, West Philippine Sea, but also against Taiwan. Next slide, please. So expressed willingness to allow American forces to use the Philippines as a staging ground. And this, of course, started a series of development that led to the improvement of Philippine-U.S. security relations. Eventually, of course, he decided to end the termination process of the Visiting Forces Agreement that he tried to abrogate in February 2020. Then by November 2021, the Philippines and the United States came out with a joint vision for the alliance. So what you see is, a dramatic improvement that's happening in terms of our Philippine-U.S. alliance actually began during the latter part of the Duterte administration, primarily because Duterte realized that China might be really serious and, of course, crossing the Taiwan Strait and effecting, an invasion of Taiwan, which would affect about 160,000 Filipino workers that are, of course, based in Taiwan. Next slide, please. So let's proceed, but nothing came out. There was no negotiation at that time. Rather, there's still, of course, feeling in Washington, D.C., or even here in the U.S. Embassy in Manila, that Duterte might not be that serious. But actually, he was. He basically realized that it doesn't pay to appease China. So let's see what's been happening recently. I'll just breeze through this. Next slide, please. So this happened last year during the meeting between Secretary Lloyd Austin, then the officer in charge of the Department of National Defense, Jose Faustino, who of course announced their commitment, the reaffirmation of the commitment to the 1951 Mutual Defense Treaty. Next slide, please. France also admitted the necessity of modernizing the alliance. Modernizing refers, of course, to the fact that it had to shift into other areas away from the South China Sea, and that the Philippine-U.S. alliance has to be linked with other U.S. alliances, specifically, of course, the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty, and even, of course, the U.S.-Australian security relations. Next slide, please. So there's some of the discussion. You have more military exercises that would be conducted this year, from 250 last year to about 500. Next slide, please. Both sides also agreed to ensure robust military-to-military relations and conduct, of course, what is being discussed right now here in Manila are, of course, joint maritime exercises, not only between the Philippines and the United States, but also with the inclusion of Japan and Australia. Next slide, please. More significantly, of course, what was announced early February, that the increase in a number of what we call joint location, or what we call enhanced defense cooperation sites. They are, of course, American, they're infrastructures that will be improved or built by the U.S. military inside 5 Philippine Air Force bases. Now, of course, there's supposed to be an increase of 4. People here are speculating that this might involve port facilities that will be useful for the United States Navy and, of course, the United States Marine Corps. Next slide, please. So sites will provide, of course, U.S. forces with strategic vantage point from which, of course, they can mount operation if push comes to shove, not only in the South China Sea, but more importantly, in Taiwan. Next slide, please. So at the same time, you have, of course, dramatic increase in joint exercises. Balikatan this year will involve about 17,000 Philippine, U.S., and Australian forces, with probably the Japanese sending observers. A significant contingent that will be involved again in Balikatan exercise is the newly formed U.S. Marine Littoral Regiment, that, of course, is also training with its Philippine counterpart. So even the Philippines had formed a littoral marine battalion that definitely, of course, would be used in, in push comes to shove situation, not probably just in the South China Sea, but, in other possible scenarios. Next slide, please. So what would be the impact of the increase in EDCA sites? Of course, increased training. It's envisioned that units, squadrons from the United States Marine Corps, the United States Air Force, and of course even the United States Navy could use those air bases to, of course, be acclimated into possible warfighting scenarios in a Southeast Asian tropical environment. Next slide, please. Then, of course, port facilities for the United States Navy and United States Marine Corps ships. Those would be port facilities that might be used in northern Luzon. Next slide, please. And of course, if push comes to shove, launching pads for U.S. air, naval, and even, of course, amphibious operation coming, of course, from northern Luzon. Next slide, please. So this is, in a way, there is a sort of acceptance now in the Philippine government of the possibility that, the Philippines would have to honor its treaty obligation with the United States. And of course, given our geographic proximity, with Taiwan, we have no choice but, of course, to honor again our treaty obligation to our only formal treaty ally, that's, of course, the United States. Next slide, please. So Manila is now aware that if an armed conflict between Beijing and Taiwan erupts and intensifies, we cannot, of course, accept the collateral damages or the impact we'll have in terms of rapid return of Filipino overseas workers, which is, of course, the primary concern of the government, and, of course, the possibility that the conflict might spread from Taiwan across the Luzon Strait and even, of course, northern Luzon. Next slide, please. Marcos administration, of course, had found it necessary to improve Philippine security relations as it openly expressed the need to cooperate with Washington in possible strategic contingency, of course, in Taiwan and of course even the South China Sea. Next slide, please. So, although President Marcos has not explicitly stated that his country would assist the United States in any armed conflict, this, of course, stems from the fact that, as any other leader, you don't want to be your country to be dragged in any other conflict. But in his more recent statement, there seems to be an acceptance that because of geography, because of our treaty obligation, and the fact that armed neutrality is not an option. Simply because the Philippines, of course, has been so focused on internal security, it simply doesn't have the credible military capability to even contemplate the prospect of armed neutrality. At the end of the day, there's a recognition that we have to rely on our, of course, our treaty obligation with the United States. Next slide, please. So the last statement, of course, was his speech. And just last week, during his visit to the Western Command, he told the units of the Navy and the Air Force, we really have to take into account geopolitical realities. So we have to focus away from internal security to, of course, what happened beyond our maritime borders. I end my presentation here, and I look forward to a very dynamic conversation.
All right, Dr. DeCastro, thank you very much. I would say on 2 points, both for a very comprehensive and informative presentation there, as well as for the very generous use of cartoons, of which I'm always a very big fan. And so I enjoyed it very much on both of those 2 accounts. I jotted down a few questions of my own, but I'm going to hold off on those as points to delve into a bit more later. But thank you very much, sir. I think next I will turn the floor over to Dr. Aoki from the RAND Corporation to speak with us about both the way that these issues have played out in Japan and in the Indo-Pacific region. Dr. Aoki, the floor is yours, ma'am.
Thank you. Thank you for involving me in this very important conversation. I have to start with a disclaimer that what I'm about to say is my personal opinion. It's not the RAND Corporation's. And I will talk a little bit about Japan's threat perception, what Japan is doing to deal with the threats, and a little bit about Japan's constraints in terms of dealing with these the threats that it faces. The bottom line is that concerns over tensions across the Taiwan Strait is a major motivation for why more people, both in terms of the public and in terms of the political elites in Japan, want stronger defense measures today for the country. And Japan is trying to strengthen its own defenses, not just by acquiring new capabilities, but also by enhancing security cooperation, of course, with the United States, but with others as well. So first, I'll go over some of the threats that Japan is concerned about. First and foremost is the tensions across the Taiwan Strait. This is at the top of the list. There was the presentation earlier talked about the geographical proximity between Taiwan and the Philippines. Japan is also close to Taiwan. The westernmost island of Yonaguni is about 70 miles or 110 kilometers from Taiwan. So that's pretty close. And that's one element. And our the concerns are renewed because of a couple of reasons. Well, one of which is that the tensions are taking place at a time of strategic competition between the United States and China. What this means, this could be a flashpoint where it could trigger a major war between 2 major powers that could have devastating consequences for everybody. And against this background, the Japanese people's affinity toward Taiwan is growing as well. So in an opinion conducted in late 2021 in Japan, 75.9%, so 76% of Japanese people said that they feel close to Taiwan. And 71.4% said that Japan-Taiwan relations were good. This contrasts with the same poll in late 2016, whose numbers were 66.5% and 60.2 respectively. 66.5 and 60.2 is not bad at all, but it has increased considerably. And this means that there's the broader public in Japan cares about Taiwan, which of course matters for Japanese politics. If Japan is not at the point where you're going to have official relations with Taiwan, but Japan and Taiwan have vibrant unofficial ties, and it also means that the political leaders have more reason it's being pushed by the public to care more about Taiwan. Other issues, other threats that Japan faces include tensions over the Senkaku Islands. This has been going on, as you probably know, from the early 2010s. There were a couple of incidents that heightened the tensions there, especially in 2012, when Japan nationalized the islands by purchasing them from a private landowner to reinforce administrative control and prevent private groups from visiting. Well, this raised tensions. China's incursions into the air and sea around that area increased from that time period. It has continued, but it's a little bit. It has become a little bit of a regular kind of event. Obviously, this is concern, but it's not as sort of at the forefront of people's minds as they were probably a couple of years ago. North Korea is quantitatively and qualitatively improving its nuclear and missile arsenal, test firing missiles, dozens of missiles, and one of which flew over Japan in October 2022 last year for the first time in 5 years. So this is also obviously a concern for Japan. The Russian invasion of Ukraine is also a concern for Japan because this is a case in which a revisionist power is trying to change the status quo by using force. So this is a reason why Japan is concerned both at the political elite level and the ordinary public. And another point that is perhaps not getting as much attention, but nevertheless important, I think, is the cooperation between and among China, Russia, and North Korea in the wake of the war in Ukraine. So if I were a Japanese defense official, I would be worrying about a possible Taiwan contingency and something happening on the northern side of Japan, so on its border with Russia. Chinese and Russians have been conducting strategic bomber runs around Japan. This predates the war in Ukraine, but this is a level of cooperation that has developed over time. And depending on how this cooperation, both between and among the three countries, how they pan out is going to matter a lot for Japan. And this, of course, because Japan has had to worry about China and North Korea, and now it's has to worry about possibly hostile Russia as well. So, and I would also note that this is also because Japan chose to swiftly condemn Russia for its actions in Ukraine and imposed an unprecedented level of sanctions against Russia in the wake of the war in Ukraine. So what is Japan doing to deal with this situation? So as I mentioned, all this has heightened the threat perceptions, both among the political elite and the ordinary public, in ordinary Japanese in the country. And there's a stronger support for defense measures, which has translated into an increase in defense spending. So Japan's budget for fiscal 2023, which begins in on April 1st, is 6.8 trillion yen. That's about $50 billion, and that is a 26% increase from the year before. This is the first budget under the new national security strategy, which was published along with two other documents, the National Defense Program Guidelines and the Midterm Defense Plan. And these were released last year. And in the national security strategy, Japan, that includes a target to increase defense spending to 2% of GDP in 2027. This will make Japan the third biggest defense spender in the world. So this is a fairly significant development. This is a shift, of course, from Japan's previous target. This is an informal guideline, informal cap, but nevertheless maintained for a long time of 1% of GDP in terms of defense spending. And this was partly to signal Japan's intention that it will remain what it translates as exclusively defense-oriented policy. Now, of course, Japan has not abandoned this exclusively defense-oriented policy, but it is thinking of new ways in which it could defend itself. And there's political capital to make some of those steps happen. I should also explain a little bit about the exclusively defense-oriented policy. It means that defense force can only be used in an event of an attack, and that the extent of the use of that force should be the minimum necessary for self-defense, and that Japan should maintain defense capabilities that is limited to the minimum necessary for self-defense. So I just talked about the increase in defense spending. Well, what is Japan going to do with that money? Well, one of the measures that received a lot of attention was Japan's plan to acquire counter-strike capabilities. So this is the ability to attack enemy missile bases when an attack is imminent. And this is another step that Japan had said earlier, actually from the 1950s, that it's actually legal for Japan to do this. That was the Japanese government's legal interpretation of its legal constraints, but they didn't really. It was not politically possible until this time. So Japan is considering different types of missiles, including the purchase of hundreds of US-made Tomahawk cruise missiles. It's also trying to domestically develop hypersonic flying vehicles with a maximum range of 3,000 kilometers in the first half of the 2030s. So what is Japan doing apart from acquiring new capabilities? Well, Japan views its alliance with the United States as a cornerstone of its security policy, but it is strengthening its security cooperation with other countries bilaterally and multilaterally. That is the case with the Philippines, but also with the striking case is Japan's security cooperation with Australia. Japan signed a renewed joint declaration on security cooperation last year. And while this is not a formal treaty or legally binding, together with the reciprocal access agreement that the two countries signed in 2022, they aim to make it possible for the two countries to defense forces to operate together seamlessly. Japan is also active in multilateral exercises as well as the quadrilateral security dialogue, which groups Australia, India, Japan, and the United States. Of course, the Quad says it's not a security grouping, it's not a defense organization. But there are some security elements to it. They do cooperate over dual-use technologies, for example, and the 4 countries that are involved in the Quad are all in the Malabar exercises, for example. And more importantly, the organization aims to promote the free and open rules-based order. This means that it's aiming to shape a favorable balance of power in the region. So those are some of the examples of what Japan is doing. So So I talked a little bit about how Japan faces constraints as well. I'll go over a little bit of those. As I mentioned earlier, Japan maintains its exclusively self-defense policy. And in terms of Taiwan, any action Japan could take in a possible crisis will depend on the top level leadership judgments about the nature of that particular incident. And this will include things like how it began, how Taiwan and Washington have responded, and how Japan perceives the threat to itself. There are three main categories for the threats that Japan can categorize them into. And one is called the important influence situation. Second one is called survival threatening situation, and third one is armed attack situation. And they all differ in terms of what Japan can do. For example, if it's an important influence situation, the defense forces can provide logistical support, but it can exercise the right to collective self-defense only if it's deemed a survival threatening situation. So the second category, armed attack situation would be, as you can imagine, Japan could defend itself. So there are, different categories, and that's going to depend on what that particular situation is. There is a new sense of urgency and openness to deepen bilateral planning with Washington and Japan to enhance deterrence and to prepare options if deterrence fails. So in terms of Japan, it's very difficult, if not impossible, for Japan to say Japan will defend Taiwan. But of course, Japan can say it will defend itself. And by acquiring capabilities to defend itself, that might also have and that hopefully has the effect of complicating the strategic calculus of the PRC. So that's one of the things that Japan can do and is doing. And in addition to that, it could further strengthen bilateral cooperation with other like-minded countries so that there is what some people call the thickening of the web of security cooperation in that region, and just generally, create resilience, increase resilience, and help shape a favorable balance of power in the region. This could be particularly important, as I said, as we may see a further strengthening of cooperation between China, North Korea, and Russia. Thank you.
All right, Dr. Aoki, thank you very much for, again, a very comprehensive overview. I've been making some notes for myself, but I think one of the perils of being a moderator is when the panelists do give such comprehensive discussions of an issue. It makes it trickier to ask questions later, but I'll be doing my best. Now, and last and certainly not least, I would like to turn to Lieutenant General Wallace Chip Gregson to discuss with us some of the ways in which these events or developments may have affected U.S. defense policy in the Pacific. And we do have a graphic. Good. All right, gentlemen, I will turn the floor over to you, sir.
Thank you very much. Let me first endorse the presentation by Dr. Cruz and Dr. Aoki. I fully associate myself with all the observations and conclusions therein. I would like also to make note of one particular one that Dr. Aoki made. Conflict anywhere in East Asia is likely to very quickly become conflict everywhere. You got three revisionist governments there: China, Russia, North Korea. There's no reason that if it's conflict starts in the south, that the two countries up to the north are not going to want to take advantage of that. So the American habit of kind of segmenting these conflicts into different areas bears some caution. Let me explain the chart that we've got up here. It's not a Mercator projection. It shows countries in a more accurate relation to each other, and it certainly shows a better depiction of the distances involved, be they short or be they long. The first and second island chain are shown in the proper relations. Our vital interests, of course, lie along the first island chain. It is in our interest to protect the territory, the interest in the lives of our allies and friends, specifically including Taiwan. Okinawa is shown, and Americans tend to think of Okinawa as one island. It's actually hundreds of islands that form the barrier of the East China Sea. And as Dr. Aoki pointed out, Yonaguni is 70 miles or less from Taiwan. It's actually south of Taipei in latitude. Japan recently put self-defense force units down for surveillance, and they're building up other capabilities there, along with other islands in the archipelago. This chart, in my memory, made its first appearance in every official government office during the Abe administration. And it's certainly an indication of the way Japan is looking at the distances. I mentioned the second island chain. It's all there on the map, including the relations from Biwo-to to the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, to Yap, which belongs to the Federated States of Micronesia, Republic of Palau, and Mactan in the Philippines. It's one that Guam, the Yap, to Palau, to Mactan are hops easily made by a short-range helicopter, just to give you a degree of appreciation for the military geography here. Our logistics are likely to be based across this chart here, including islands whose names resonate with history, but with some distinct differences from the past. Now all are within the range of our enemies, thanks to long-range precision weapons that technology brought us. Geography is not changing, but changes in technology and national ambitions, and it changed the security offered by a region's geography. We have some old habits to break. For the last half of the 20th century and into this century, geography offered a degree of stability between continental nations and maritime nations. We came rushing back to Asia in 1950 as a result of the Korean War and the onset of the Cold War. In those days, Japan became the rear area. In its day, the UN Rear Command from Korea still resides in Japan at Dakota Air Force Base, and Korea was a combat theater. So Japan became the sanctuary, Korea became the combat theater. Our friends and allies enjoyed a degree of success and security behind unchallenged U.S. air and sea superiority. We could go where we wanted, project forces ashore as we wished, stay as long as we wanted, etc. Those days are now gone. It used to be the continental nations, specifically China and North Korea, had no way to project power out to seaward. That's changed. As Dr. Aoki mentioned about the missiles, China's constructed a vast missile arsenal across their entire geographic sanctuary. North Korea, despite decades of sanctions that we continually say are the strongest ever, et cetera, North Korea continues charging on their missile program and their nuclear program. Anything, pervasive surveillance and weapons act with a distance are the new reality. Anything that can be found can be attacked, and nothing can hide if it's big. We increasingly speak of the littorals, especially regarding the first island chain. Littoral is defined by the U.S. Defense Department as two segments of the operational environment. The seaward is the area from the open ocean to the shore, which must be controlled to support operations ashore. And the landward is the area inland from the shore that can be supported and defended directly from the sea. Reduced to plain language minus the jargon, the littoral is the area where forces in one terrestrial domain can have a decisive effect on forces in the other terrestrial domain. In days of sail, this was defined by the range of cannons. In those days, it was said a ship is a fool to fight a fort. You can think of the British at Fort McHenry up the road in Baltimore. Later, the littoral was defined by the range of airplanes and major caliber weapons. Now, thanks to long-range precision weapons and pervasive surveillance, the literal is greatly expanded and almost limitless. With this de facto explanation of the literal, the stability of our deterrence is based on the maritime democracy of East Asia is reduced. It follows that if forces on land and sea can affect each other at greater and greater distances, then it is no longer useful to talk about separate and sequential sea, land, and air operations. This is an age of joint power and service adaptation to the conditions. Part of the United States Air Force answer to being within the Chinese weapons engagement zone is something they call their Agile Combat Employment, or ACE, naturally for the Air Force. The U.S. Transportation Command is not an armed service as we think of armed services, but its support is crucial for our forward forces. Transcom looks at the theater in terms of access, basing, and overflight, or OBO, and the inevitable Defense Department acronym. The U.S. Army also has major responsibilities short of the battle area in the joint force. Access is not something that starts with the war. It's an important function now and will get even more important. Theater security cooperation is the military component of what must be a national effort to ensure our access, basing, and operations across the nations of the Pacific to support any operation in Asia. Included in theater security cooperation is the training of Taiwan's forces. We're beginning to break the isolation of those forces since 1979. We have trainers both in Taiwan, and we are bringing larger and larger Taiwan formations to the United States to train here. The Air Force is facing problem. They have, quote, in their words, they have studied every single piece of concrete in the Pacific to find new places to fight from. The vast distance of the Pacific region and the growing reach of the Chinese military has led the U.S. to look for ways to disperse its forces and their bases. For the U.S. Air Force, this means scouring the region for runways and facilities that can support aircraft as they try to spread out and sustain potential combat operations. According to the Pacific Air Force commander, what we're doing is taking advantage of airfields that already exist. We're going to put an F-22 or a F-15 or a C-130 into an airfield. It has to have certain criteria. So we've actually studied every single piece of concrete in the Pacific, et cetera. The Air Force did this in the 1990s. They looked at it. They experimented with it in Alaska. Fortunately, the officer that was in command in Alaska is now the commanding general of PACAF. So he knows the territory on which he's embarking. On the Navy side, according to Admiral Paparo, the commander of the Pacific Fleet, the Navy needs to shed 20 years of how it rearmed and repaired its fleet and prepare for a future of increased risk in contested logistics. The old way the U.S. moved material forward in the most cost-effective manner is no longer sufficient for how the Navy and Marines will fight in the future. Quoting Admiral Paparo, operating in uncontested environments, our logistics enterprises operate on business principles. Those business principles were to resupply the force with maximum efficiency so that the American taxpayer dollar could be applied to combat power at the greatest point of need. In our operational plans for high-end combat, we've got to think less in terms of maximum efficiency and more in terms of maximum effectiveness. Reality of vulnerable supply lines for naval units forward and the difficulty repairing and rearming ships forward has become a tricky problem set for the Navy and Marines that are shaping concepts to fight spread across the sea. Answering a question on fixing battle-damaged ships, Admiral Paparo described a, quote, arc of contested sustainment that is not precisely at the zone of fire, but nor is it back way in the rear where we normally expect to be able to execute those activities in a sanctuary. For example, Paparo described flyaway repair teams that could meet battle-damaged ships for repairs, including equipment that could be transported to the point of need. Paparo said that the fleet had experimented with rearming ships at sea and flyway repair teams at the recent Valiant Shield and Indo-Pacific exercise series. Logistics conversation came as Paparo outlined the growing boldness of Chinese actions in the Western Pacific, citing the recent lacing of a Philippine Coast Guard vessel on a resupply mission by a Chinese ship and the continued ballistic missile testing in air and sea exercises around Taiwan. The Marine Littoral Regiment is one part of the larger force design intended to remedy challenges created by the continued evolution of the character of warfare, particularly the proliferation of what's also called the mature precision strike regime. The MLR will be self-deployable, multi-domain task force optimized, et cetera, et cetera. And without the jargon, we plan to fight in a widely distributed, politically sustainable, operationally resilient posture with small formations between 10 and 40 personnel scattered across the first island chain littoral. These forces will be agile and mobile and armed with weapons, accurate at distance. We're talking hundreds of miles that can integrate with other joint forces to seize and ensure sea control. These small forces, because of their size and their agility, they can hide in the terrain, they can shelter within the terrain, and therefore become survivable. And if we spread out enough targets, we present the Chinese or the North Koreans or the Russians with a targeting problem that they cannot solve. We're also pursuing special ships for these forces. It's sometimes called the light amphibious warship. The name is not important, but again, this is another small ship that can hide within the clutter on the radar and the satellite pictures, borrowed from the technology that's developed in Australia to support their mineral extraction industry. They're called stern landing ships. This is another adaptation to more effectiveness by more economy or efficiency. We stop there. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much, General, again for a very comprehensive discussion that definitely leaves a lot of ground for further discussion. But I very much appreciate the way in which you are particularly able to take some of the U.S. military jargon. I used to constantly complain myself in my own days in uniform that the U.S. military had forgotten how to speak English and spoke largely in acronym and buzzword.
That's so nobody understands.
But I think you did an excellent job in presenting some of these concepts in layman's terms. I think we'll now move to the Q&A portion of our seminar today. And once again, I would welcome questions both from those who are attending in person here in our live audience, as well as for those who may be joining us online. If you are watching the presentations remotely, once again, you can submit questions either through the chat window function in YouTube if you're watching it that way, or you can also email questions to contact@globaltaiwan.org. I think as we're getting ready to move into the Q&A, I will exercise a traditional prerogative of the moderator to ask a question or two. Again, as I said, one of the perils of having panelists who present very comprehensive overviews of their topics, it can make it a little bit trickier to ask questions. But I did still have a number that I had noted down, and perhaps even if it's not entirely new, perhaps the areas that we could drill down into a little bit further. And I think the first question I will present is one to both Dr. DeCastro and to Dr. Aoki. In discussing these very substantive changes in defense policy that have occurred both in the Philippines and Japan, seems to me that it's come out in the discussions that a lot of these things would have seemed politically impossible just a few years ago. And so obviously there's been a very substantial change in public opinion, in the body politic in these countries that has allowed that to happen. So I think, and so for example, for Dr. DeCastro, again, and this was covered in the presentation, but again, I thought perhaps draw it out maybe a little more We have seen some very dramatic shifts in the Philippines between the last couple of presidential administrations. With when President Duterte came into office, he did seem to have a very sort of anti-American attitude, and with that also seemed to want to build or closer relations with the PRC. And as Dr. Castro discussed in his presentation, that changed. And we've seen a different attitude on the part of the new presidential administration of Ferdinand Marcos. But again, it was changing even before that changeover of administrations took place. So I want to see if we could draw a little bit more for Dr. Castro, what you thought the most prominent or important factors were in bringing about that shift. Again, is it the concern of a conflict over Taiwan? Is it the maritime incidents that have occurred between Chinese and Philippine ships, and so forth? So just kind of draw a little bit more as to what has brought about that change. And similarly, for you, Dr. Aoki, in Japan as well, and as we were discussing before the seminar began, it has been really startlingly very dramatic how opinions in Japan have changed so dramatically. And again, I wanted to draw maybe just a little bit more in detail. I guess first, sort of the reasons for that has taken place, and perhaps in conjunction with that, what you would see or how you would analyze sort of possible continuing, objections or debate to these changes in Japanese defense policy, which again are quite dramatic. So perhaps maybe if I could go to Dr. DeCastro first, if you're with us, sir. How would
Here.
Yes, sir.
Well, I think the very important factor there is you have to look at an institution, and I'm referring, of course, to the armed forces of the Philippines. President Duterte really, was determined to make that shift. I don't know if you still remember in October 2016, when he announced in Beijing, I'm moving away from the United States. After he returned back from Beijing and he went to Manila, the armed forces asked him, what do you mean by shifting away from the United States? So he, of course, also during that period, he announced no more military exercises with the United States. Again, of course, the military asked him why. We could still conduct military exercises with our ally in terms of humanitarian assistance, counterterrorism, support, and so on. And also during the his term of office, he tried to basically invite a number of Chinese projects here in the Philippines. This was opposed by the military. Just an important case. There is an island in northern Luzon. It's just, in the corner of Luzon, Pacific Ocean, and the South China Sea. You have a Chinese company that wanted to build a city, a mega city. This was opposed by the Philippine Navy. The Philippine Navy pointed out, if the Chinese control this island, the name of the island is Fuga Island. So if the Chinese would control this, they will have basically control of the Luzon Strait. So it was also the military that gave a briefing to President Duterte about the possibility that you might have a conflict in Taiwan, and it would affect, of course, the Philippines. And of course, the military was also instrumental in, again, telling this current administration, we have to improve our alliance with the United States, simply because no matter we appease China or not, China would still pursue its maritime expansion. China will still continue its coercive action against, of course, the Philippine Coast Guard and the Philippine military. So the military has provided a degree of stability in, of course, ensuring that the alliance is maintained. So, of course, in the terms of public opinion, it's been consistent. 85% of the Filipinos have a very high trust rating with the United States, and of course, Japan. China usually will have the lowest. But the most important is, to what institution does a Filipino president listen to? And of course, the obvious answer, of course, is the Philippine military. So, of course, it has also something to do with its strong institutional linkage with the U.S. Armed Forces. So it basically maintained that outlook, and of course, it's very much protective of its institutional relationship with the armed forces of the United States. So this is something, of course, if you have to be in Washington, this is something I have to look at how I could maintain that stability, that institutional basis of our two countries' alliance.
Dr. Cassidy, yes, thank you very much for that, sir. Dr. Aoki?
Thank you for the question. So, I think it is a combination of, various elements that are, behind this strong support, in Japan for, stronger defense measures and obviously the tensions in Taiwan and North Korea. And I was talking with, General Gregson earlier about how the Russian invasion of Ukraine has had an impact on Japan, and this is not just because it's a revisionist power trying to change the status quo with military force, but it's also shown how the traditional pathways of garnering international support, when things like this happen, particularly even the Security Council, isn't really functioning in the way that the countries that really want to maintain the rules-based order, it's not working the way it has and it should. And obviously, General Gregson speak for himself about this, but I agree with that view. And this is particularly important for Japan because of Taiwan, but also because of North Korea, right? Because North Korea is able to basically improve its missile and nuclear arsenal because China and Russia are on its side, and North Korea we have not been collectively been able to say anything about North Korea's test firing of an ICBM. So this is clearly not working, and this is one of the sources of concern for Japan. And I will also note that, a lot of what's happening right now was part of former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's vision. He was instrumental in institutionalizing a Quad, for example. And the idea behind that was that Japan, yes, obviously, Japan should cooperate with the United States. That was a cornerstone of Japan's security policy. But Japan should also try to cooperate with others, like-minded countries, in order to create a favorable environment. So that's part of what Japan is doing. It's clearly stated in the national security strategy, but that has its roots in in Prime Minister Abe's administration. And former Prime Minister Abe was the strong proponent for a 2% GDP defense spending. And this was not exactly, didn't have huge support when he started saying it, but by the time he was killed last year, it had support for this idea had grown by that time. So, and in terms of debate in Japan, of course, there is continuing debate about various aspects of Japan's security policy, including what counterstrike capabilities mean and under what conditions should Japan employ those capabilities. And that's a debate that's still on.
Good. Thank you, Dr. Aoki. I think I had one more question, which again, I'm using the moderator's prerogative. I'd like to direct to you, General Gregson. You touched upon this briefly in your presentation when you were mentioning the Taiwan military having been sort of in a state of professional isolation for some time. You mentioned some of the recent steps to come out of, again, which I believe you referred to as the 1979 or post 1979 isolation. And it's something that you and I had discussed a little bit offline, but perhaps to, at the risk of putting you on the spot a little bit, I wanted to ask, based on your own experience with that, what you would see as sort of the greatest needs in terms of international cooperation and international engagement for Taiwan's military forces in terms of engaging either with the U.S. or whether it's with other countries in the Asia-Pacific region, in sort of in terms of the greatest needs they would have for professionalization and how they might benefit the most from sort of more cooperative engagement. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I do, thank you. And part of the isolation problem, of course, came with the change in recognition of who's going to sit in the UN seat and other things that grew up around that. Since that time, we've maintained support for Taiwan with various items of military equipment and things, but I don't know that we spent as much time working with Taiwan on doctrine and operational concepts. And I think now that the threat picture is changing due to the mature precision strike regime or whatever you want to call it, there's ways that we need to work on making this better. The introduction of U.S. trainers into Taiwan echoes what we did with Ukraine in 2014 after Crimea was taken by the Russians. The Ukrainians' skill and dedication and courage had a lot to do with the Ukrainian resistance, but perhaps the sending of trainers to Ukraine after 2014 had something to do with it too, and I think this is part of it. We have long debates in this country about what we're going to do with Guam, and particularly the inter-service things, politics going on, and just the institutional things that Dr. Cruz mentioned had a lot to do with what we think we were trying to do with Guam, Saipan, and Vidian, and places there on the first island chain. One of the things I would offer is that due to Guam's location, it's a great place for training with the U.S. forces, Japanese forces in Guam and in the surrounding areas. We're talking about defending a series of islands, which really is what Taiwan is. Then you've got Guam, and then you've got 13 or 14 islands of the Commonwealth of the Northern Marianas, where we could do some modest exercising that might help with the development of operational concepts. It's no the Taiwan Air Force, the Taiwan Navy, as far as I know, don't have any particular recruitment problems or manning problems. The Taiwan Army does, but I think the creation of an operational concept or a series of operational concepts that are intuitively understandable by the public may have something to offer on decreasing the recruiting challenges facing Taiwan force.
All right, thank you very much, General. I do have a few other questions jotted down, but I don't wish to unduly abuse the moderator's prerogative further, and I do want to open up the floor. Siri may have a question for us. I think what I will do.
Siri, I'm talking to you.
I think what I will do is I may try to alternate questions between our live audience and some of those joining us online. So I think I will turn first to our studio audience. Sir, can we get a microphone to this gentleman here? And we'll open up for audience questions and Q&A.
I'm Peter Humphrey. I'm an intelligence analyst and a former diplomat. The number one lesson we learned from Ukraine is that if we had given everything that we intended to give a year ago, there would be tens of thousands of Ukrainians alive today who are not alive today. We have in no way absorbed that lesson with respect to Taiwan. And I don't see us absorbing that lesson with respect to Taiwan. You'll never get thousands of Stingers and HIMARS and Javelins into Taiwan in the next year or two, so they might actually be truly prepared. The alternative model would be to try and gin up production within Taiwan. For example, one of the greatest things you could do would be to reverse engineer the Shahed 146 that is being launched from Russia into Ukraine at the expense of $20,000 per pop instead of $4.6 million per pop for our missiles. Could we set up a reverse engineering production capacity within Taiwan to create this very cost-effective system and laugh at the fact that for once we are reverse engineering someone else's weapons?
Okay, thank you, sir. And thank you for that question, sir. And I might actually add one or two items into that. I know with something that's been discussed in articles that we published in the Global Taiwan Brief over the last year and a half, has been related to
some of the efforts that Taiwan's own government has been making towards increased indigenous production of some of these munitions. I think that's a story that doesn't often get discussed or get as much coverage on this side of the ocean anyway, where there's such a focus on arms sales to Taiwan rather than what Taiwan is looking to produce itself. But in terms of that sort of weapons production, I'd like to take that question, sir. And actually, I think I'll combine it perhaps with one of the questions that we have also received, a very closely related one. We have Tina Chung with the Voice of America has presented the question. Many analysts and people in Congress have said that one of the lessons from Russia's invasion of Ukraine is the idea of pre-positioning munitions and military assets in Taiwan ahead of, God forbid, a potential blockade or other major military operation directed against Taiwan. And she asked, is this something that Washington should contemplate or is currently contemplating? So that does tie in to some degree with your question, sir. I'll turn that to our panelists. Would any of you like to present a response to that or any thoughts on that?
Sure, I can briefly comment. Thank you. I think that it's an important question, and one of the geographical kind of elements for Taiwan is that it's of course more difficult to invade, but it's also that also means that it's supplying Taiwan is going to be very difficult as well. So I do think that's one of the challenges that we have to think about collectively. Yeah, and so yeah, that's my short comment, I think.
Okay. General Richardson, sir.
Couldn't agree more with our complaints about our slowness in getting things to Taiwan. I mentioned a little bit earlier about the difficulty in breaking the paradigms we become used to, or the procedures we become used to, and we're bloody slow on getting the things to Taiwan that they've already purchased. It's got to do with our acquisition processes and all these things that we're well familiar with. In addition to that, to break that is going to require some effort, and I think there's a ray of hope in this new committee that's been formed to look at China, headed by the congressman from Wisconsin, Mike Gallagher. Yeah. He had some great success, but this is not a political announcement. He had some great success with the first committee meeting and keeping it unpoliticized, which is great. So maybe we can get some accomplishment there. And nothing moves the U.S. acquisition bureaucracy faster than a poke in the eye by Congress. So I have some hopes on this. The other thing I might add on this is that we're very good we Americans are very good at lecturing Taiwan on things. You got to be a porcupine, you got to be asymmetric, but we never define the bloody thing. Besides the training provided by the trainers, we need to have some serious, continuing discussions with Taiwanese security forces and their government and officials on looking at their operational concepts and figuring out how we better manage the totality of the problems facing them. It's not just the island of Taiwan, it's all the other small islands and everything. And there's ways to do this, but we have to try and break from the shackles of the past and what we've inherited from our past doctrines and past ways of thinking. Those days were over. The idea that the part of what we're doing with the widely distributed things, which is to an advantage, is we will be fighting with our allies and friends. We're not going to build new bases. Let's say this characterization of what we're doing. We're going to be in small units in places where we're allowed to go. And as Dr. Cruz knows, one of the areas that's been opened up now for this type of visiting troops has been Palawan, which is critical to control the South China Sea. So there's ways to get at this. And there's ways to where the Japanese can make a major contribution by doing just what they're doing now. It is enhancing and robust defense of Japanese territory and interest. And with that established, We've got a lot of leverage to help with Taiwan. Love the pin, by the way. The Ukraine flag on this one is looked up and
Okay.
I'll ask.
Okay.
No,
We're to our own director.
Yeah, no, this is incredible, superb presentation, incredibly informative discussion. I have two questions. One is for General Gregson, and the other are for Dr. Cruz and Dr. Aoki. For General Gregson, one of the vital treaty allied of the United States that wasn't discussed in today's discussion is the ROK, Republic of Korea. And so I wanted to get your sense in terms of what you see you envision as the optimal role that the ROK could play both politically within the context of the US-ROK alliance, but also, in a sense of the broader strategic level, the importance of the ROK in the Taiwan contingency. The other questions for Dr. Oyoki and Dr. Cruz Castro are much of our discussion today has been focusing on the communications and planning between the United States and the Philippines and the Japanese. I wonder to what extent there are considerations in Manila and Tokyo about enhancing communication channels directly with Taipei, and what are the constraints of that, and what are the possibilities of that, given the growing concerns about a potential power contingency.
Thank you. All right, perhaps Dr. De Castro, would you perhaps be able to respond to that, sir?
Yeah, I can also address to the question regarding the ROK, because last week we had a webinar with the ROK. The ROK is simply focused on what's happening in the Korean Peninsula. I asked this question to the ROK presenter. Aren't you concerned about what might happen in the first island chain? He said, yes, we are concerned, but we simply don't have enough resources. Of course, focus on those other concerns. Plus, of course, the ROK, even up to now, is still very much sensitive to China. They still see China as a possible actor that could constrain North Korea. They still have this notion that if they please China, China would always put a lid on North Korea. I don't think that is really a very wise move on their part. But they are still stuck with this sort of a mind frame that what's only important is the Korean Peninsula. So it will take a lot of effort. Probably in the next few years, you'll be able to, basically I raised also the point. Yeah, you don't want to get involved in, let's say, in Taiwan or South Korea, but just like the Philippines, you have a mutual defense treaty with the United States. You're also obliged to assist the United States, not only in the Korean Peninsula, but also in the first island chain. So he said, yeah, probably we would send not a lot, but just basically to minimally fulfill their treaty obligation with the United States. Now, a second question, of course, is in the case of the Philippines, this is very problematic because the Philippines, unlike the United States and Japan, adopts a very legalistic and of course, rigid one China policy. We used to have security ties with Taiwan until 2003, until of course, President Gloria Macapagal Arroyo stopped this informal security relations we had with Taiwan. So we cannot do it. So we have been discussing this with the Japanese and also the Taiwanese. Japan will have to play a very important role in initiating, of course, a bilateral exchange. You have bilateral exchange between Taiwan and Japan. You don't have it with the Philippines directly. So if the Philippines will have to talk with their Taiwanese counterpart, it will have either to be in Tokyo or somewhere in the United States.
All right, thank you, Dr. De Castro. For our other panelists? Something further? Okay.
Sure. So, in terms of, I will also comment a little bit on the ROK question. I think that the concerns for the ROK, as said, is the actions of the North Koreans, and it's a legitimate concern, obviously. And I think what I hear often is, what if there's a Taiwan contingency and North Korea tries to take advantage of it, right? So it's not, they have to think of the possibility of both of them having taking place at the same time. So that's kind of the source of the concern I think our OK has. And I think because of that, we all have to, talk to each other and try to figure out, what our concerns are and how we can collectively deal with it. In terms of Japan's interactions with Taipei, well, Japan has a purposefully ambiguous policy toward Taiwan, and I think regarding Taiwan and Japan's policy, as you know, has been official policy has been that it understands and respects China's PRC's claim, but obviously it has maintained very vibrant unofficial relations with Taiwan. There are a lot of political and legal constraints when it comes to certain relationships. And I think Japan will also have to think of, whether it makes sense to do that. Would it, will there be more harm in certain steps than more, cons than pros, I guess, than the upsides of certain actions. So those are some of the decisions that Japan has to make. And that's a very good good example of such.
Okay, thank you, Doctor. I think I'll go to another online question, then one from our audience. We've received a question from Guermantes Leilari, an author who's written for us before for the GTB publication, so we know well, and he's currently a visiting scholar at the National Zhengzhi University in Taiwan. And he's asked the question, given that the U.S. military is now beginning to openly train and exercise in Taiwan, or at least certainly have a more open mill-to-mill relationship with Taiwan. He asked, can the speakers discuss how would the ROC, that's Republic of China, Taiwan, how would the ROC military be able to train and exercise with the militaries of the region, such as Japan, South Korea, Philippines, Australia, and others? And I actually might take that and maybe expand it a little bit beyond just the a very narrow mill-to-mill discussion, but to present the question. So what would be the practical impediments or difficulties, legal or otherwise, for some other countries in the region to sort of build upon or to have a more robust security relationship with Taiwan? Would any of you have any thoughts on that question?
Of course, obviously, it's China. China will always be watching us. China would immediately file a diplomatic protest here in Manila. You have to adopt, remember, always remind us of this one China policy, that Taiwan is only a province of China. So that's, a practical obstacle we have to take into account. My suggestion is, if there'll be, of course, a joint military exercise between these concerned countries, it could adopt the model of the RIMPAC. Everyone is familiar with RIMPAC, and it should be held outside of the region, away, of course, from the privy eye of, mainland China. Probably somewhere in the United States. That's the ideal place. But of course, this would entail a lot of resources. But of course, again, you have to take into account, China would always be watching our actions here, especially in this part of the world.
All right, Dr. Castro, thank you. So, Joseph?
Yeah, I would suggest that training at neutral sites where the United States could invite allies to visit and train. Guam suggests that we're not going to recreate the International Military Training Center anywhere west of California, but with liberal application of the Arctic simulation, we can do an awful lot of training that is discreet as far as any outside observers goes, but be able to increase contact to help with force development, operational concept development, and all these things. Might also add something else that hasn't been mentioned yet about Japan's overall contribution to security in the region. Japan is the most trusted nation in ASEAN by polling figures, and we're riding Japan's coattails on this for obvious reasons. But a lot of lot of Japanese investment can go to ASEAN nations that is then turned around and used to purchase defense articles from Japan, which Japan is now, by their new interpretations, allowed to export. The Philippines is recently a beneficiary of this. This also affects what I was trying to lead to with the problems of all the island nations across the Pacific that have the opportunity to either aid or obstruct our logistics pipeline in an emergency. And Japanese investment in a lot of these small island nations, along with U.S. investment, I would submit is a relatively small payment for major benefits that will be necessary, might be necessary in the future.
All right, thank you, sir. Going back to our audience, I believe we had a hand up over here. Sir, if we could get the microphone to this gentleman.
Thanks so much. My name is Ken Stanley from Marbury Corporation. So I just want to raise a little bit provocative question. So do you think, would you say we are already the trajectory toward World War III because today's situation sounds me both alike South Korea alliance and the other one is so you Quran. So it reminded me some you know now it's only 1 year after the Ukraine invasion. So do you think we are already this trajectory? And if you do, is there any lesson from the World War II to prevent World War III?
Okay. At the risk of jumping on the panel's toes, I'll offer my own very brief response to that in terms of whether or not we're headed for World War III. I certainly hope not. And I might have to start piling canned food. But for more seriously, I'll look to our, I guess, drawing of that, I'm particularly interested in the question as to, you know, from your question, sir, and from some of the comments that made by the panels, as to whether or not we are indeed seeing the emergence of a rival alliance system in the Indo-Pacific or the Asia Pacific region, and if so, you know, what's the proper policy response to that? Any thoughts from any of our panelists in regards to that?
I'll jump on that one. There are lessons from history that need to be learned here, and you hit on it. One of the things that is different, in my opinion, from the onset of World War II is the strong showing of NATO on behalf of Ukraine. Yeah, we could have done better by getting Ukraine more stuff quicker, but this is a much more robust response to an attack than NATO's even expanding. Fits and starts here with Sweden and Finland, thanks to Turkey, but it's a much different posture, and European nations have increased their defense budgets and things as a result of this. Russia has, if nothing else, focused on some thinking. Dr. Aoki is more qualified to talk on this than I am, but from a layman's point of view, the evolution, revolution, whatever we wish to call it, within Japan, starting with the Prime Minister Abe's second term and all the things that went on there, now being carried on by Prime Minister Kishida, is a great enhancement to our deterrence. And we've got to get the deterrence in place to make sure that at the bottom line, when all policy fails and everything, that North Korea, China, Russia cannot make any logical decision that today is the day. We're complicated by the need for homeland defense in Japan and the Philippines and other places, but thinking of Korea's attempts to coerce Japan like they try to coerce South Korea, threats to with weapons of mass destruction, direct weapons, but with increasing the ability to do integrated air and defense along with that. There's an organization in the United States called Freedom House. It's a government-sponsored and non-governmental organizations that are described that way. Freedom is expanding across the globe or declining. Recently, the reports are all very depressing. It's going the other way. So beyond just the very smart demonstrated by Japan recently, and the Philippines, soft power is absolutely necessary to make sure that we support right-thinking governments and we support those places that are, they're all important, but those places that would be critical to us if we had to reinforce our capabilities. I think your question is apt. We need to pay attention to this. We mentioned North Korea more than a few times here, but North Korea's ability to continue to flout international conventions, particularly the threat that they present to Japan and South Korea, is something that's got to be managed, and it is all key to this to deterrence across the Pacific. It's not just one nation anymore; it's three of them, and we need to continue to develop like we're doing.
Yes, I would like to add a little bit. In terms of World War III, well, as Mr. Dawson mentioned, I hope not. And I hope that doesn't happen. We're all working to make sure, or try to make sure that doesn't happen. And the good news is nobody wants three. And the way I know I talked about the cooperation or increasing cooperation between and among China, Russia, and North Korea in the wake of the war in Ukraine. But I would not call that an alliance. Although China and North Korea are actually technically treaty allies, they renewed their treaty in 2021. So they're technically treaty allies, but it's not that they cooperate when they want to, but they're not the best of friends. China, as you, and I think China's support for Russia, particularly for the war in Ukraine, has been enthusiastic. So they're not exactly the best of friends. And also, I would also note that the United States and its allies and partners know what they want in terms of, trying to protect the rules-based order, whereas the China, North Korea, and Russia, it's unclear what they are for. We know what they're against, but we don't really know what they're for. And so I would include those elements in what what you stated your question.
I add one of these, but we, the United States, missed an opportunity earlier. And we did we did a great disservice to the Philippines. When China started its illegal land grab in the South China Sea, think of it, they dredged up enough coral and ocean bottom to create 3,000 or more new acres of what turned out to be airfields and deep water ports. People that study marine science, small and marine science, that maintain it, that see, with a disastrous follow-on effect for prosperity in Asia, and it's on products. Philippines alone brought a challenge to the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague. The United States remained silent, in my opinion, shamefully. And the Court of Arbitration, the court decision came down in favor of the Philippine case. The United States again remained silent. President Obama had a conversation with Xi Jinping at the Sunnyland Summit in California, and Xi Jinping, to President Obama's face, told him he would not militarize those features in the South China Sea. Bang, by the weekend, we've got runways and airports and SAM installations. That is a parallel, I think, maybe to the Europe of World War II. It's not an exact parallel, but it's a rough one. That's when we don't stand up for things that we believe in, a free and open international, free and open Indo-Pacific. Thank you, Prime Minister Abe, for that term, for the liberal international order that we believe in. Then bad things happen. We need to, it's not just military power, it's diplomacy, it's everything else, but we need to resist attacks on these things.
All right, thanks, sir. I think we might perhaps have time for one more question. I know, sir, you had your hand up a little bit. If you get a microphone to this gentleman, then please identify yourself and give us your question.
Customers good. Not to be too depressing, but do you think the tenets of mutually assured destruction still apply when one person irrationally can make moves, all of the military advances and all the supply chain improvements and all of that, and throwing into that picture the idea espoused here by some speakers that the real issue is what we do terrestrially, but we have to arm space.
Thank you. Perhaps Dr. Aoki, I know much of your work has been on nuclear security policy.
Yeah, so I think and I'm going to take your question, mutually assured destruction in the nuclear policy sense. And in terms of nuclear policy, nuclear security policy, the challenge today is it's no longer just on a mutually assured destruction kind of worked when it was the United States and the Soviet Union. Now the United States has to worry about Russia and China, which is increasing its basically conducting a rapid military modernization, nuclear modernization as well. So what the United States has to worry is, what if the two countries work together, right? That changes the equation. So I think that's a complicated factor. That's a complicating factor that is going to change the way we think about that particular aspect of nuclear mutually assured destruction. But I think your question may have been in a wider sense, because did you mention chips, like semiconductors, or did you mean that?
We're talking about every year we're behind in this category of weapons, this category of weapons. They're all conventional weapons.
Oh, okay.
And at some point, somebody says, I'm not going to lose. I don't care how many, we're not going to take these losses. If the Ukraine was nuclear armed, would they have tolerated the attacks that they've sustained? We presume that we have a solution and we have no choice but to think conventionally and respond. And you say no appeasement, but at some point, the loser isn't going to accept a loss.
Yes, thank you. So I will just note that deterrence is, it's not just about like increasing your defense capabilities. It's also about assurance in the sense that the adversary has to know that nothing terrible will happen to the adversary if it refrains from certain actions. And that requires signaling, messaging, and policy as well. So it has to be an overall policy that includes basically building up your defense capabilities, but also diplomacy and talking to the other side.
All right, thank you, Dr. Aoki. I think we're coming up to the end of our time, as is always unfortunately the case with these seminars. You have more topic than you do time. And I think we have come to the end of our allotted scheduled time. I'd like to ask all of you to join me in a brief round of applause for all of our panelists. Especially Dr. DeCastro, I want to give a special note of thanks to you, sir, for joining us at such an uncivilized hour, Manila time. But thank you for joining us, and sharing your insights with us. And I don't want to prevent you any further from being able to get to bed, but thank you very much.
Hopefully, I'll be there by summer because I'll be
well.
spending 3 months in Washington, D.C. as a fellow in the East West Center.
Excellent. We'll look forward to seeing you. Well, to you, sir, to Dr. Aoki, General Gregson, thank you very much for sharing your insights with us today. And once again, thank you to all of you who have joined in our audience, either in person or online.